Welcome to Euler's Diorama Warehouse, where we specialize in what you don't need. You need it? We don't got it. We got it? You don't need it. You want it? Too bad. Can't have it. But for the low price of free, you can make it yourself, and we'll show you how. What do you need a diorama for? Oh, well, for example, maybe you've got your Mandos, your Jar Jar, your Grogu, or Beskar, some black beans, Bob Ross, Greedo and Boss, Optimus, Elsa, or even your lightsaber-stealing kleptomaniac. Welcome to the video, everybody. I hope you like that intro. I had fun making that. I'm just sketching up some basic plans here for my diorama ideas. This isn't necessarily going to be what I'm going to commit to, but it's just to help give my brain the idea for kind of the vibe I'm going for. I'm just using some pencils and pens to sketch it out, just kind of drawing some boxy three-dimensional views just to give myself an idea where I might be wanting to go with the design. Please hit that like and subscribe before you get too far into the video. I really appreciate it, and hitting that thumbs up button helps YouTube know that people might be interested in my video. So please hit those before we continue. And if you decide to do a sketch like this, sort of a pre-visualization, if you will, don't worry, your sketch doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to be something that you can reference so you know where you might be going with your design down the road. I was designing these to fit into a D-tall shelf. That's those IKEA shelves that are about 14 wide, 12 deep, and 15 tall. That was my rough measurements that I took. We're going to use this pink XPS foam. The brand is Foamular. You can get this at Home Depot. Other hardware stores carry it. It might be in a different color or a different brand, but it's XPS foam. That curved piece of the foam that I'm showing you is something that happens when these are pushed through the mill. It can bend up a little bit. So I'm avoiding that 4 or 5 inch piece of foam as I cut off my first piece of foam at 14 inches wide. I'm just going to go ahead and use these extendable sharp box knives, these box cutters. They're generally the best to cut through this foam if you don't have a hot wire foam cutter, which I will show you in a minute. You want a very sharp blade, and you want a straight edge. And the goal is to keep your blade as perfectly perpendicular to the foam as you can, basically just straight up and down. And about 5 or 6 cuts in, you see how deep you get. You don't get very deep because this foam is very dense. But once you've done that type of a cut, you can go ahead and just use it as a guide without the straight edge and separate the pieces just fine. Sometimes you will get a little bit of a tilt in your edge when you do that because it's hard to cut a perfectly straight cut. But if you see that you've done that, and you can see even with a nice sharp knife, you get a little bit of tear out on your foam. It's not a big deal though, because you can knock it down with sandpaper. This is 80 grit sandpaper on a rubber sanding block. You can buy pre-made sanding blocks for just a couple of bucks at the hardware store. I have a sanding block, and I just buy sanding paper and switch it out. So just a few strokes and you can knock down that edge and make it much straighter. You can see that there. So don't push with the sandpaper, by the way, just let it do the work. Just glide it across the top. Here I am making a second cut from one of my cutoff pieces to get my 12 by 14 inch base. I'm switching to a smaller straight edge. I have a variety of straight edges, but you know, if you just have the 12-inch ruler, you'll do just fine with that. Again, I'm making a few cuts here just to give myself a guide, and then I'm moving that straight edge away so I can push a little bit harder without worrying about holding that straight edge in place. And you can see pretty quickly within a few strokes you can separate the foam. Now, this did have a little bit of a tilted edge, and again, I'm going back with that 80 grit sandpaper. I'm not pushing, I'm just gliding it across and paying attention to that angle as it gets knocked down straight, and putting it on my cutting mat to make sure that it's straight. I'm using that piece of foam that I cut off on top of one of my other pieces of foam as a measuring tool to make sure the adjoining piece will be exactly the same width. Sometimes that's much better than measuring another piece. If you know it's going to be the same width, just put that piece down and draw a line. Again, for my initial cuts, I'm going to use a straight edge to trim those in. Just a few cuts will get that, and then we get through it pretty easily. That was a nice straight cut, didn't have to knock it down. Just takes a little bit of practice. I'm just testing the fit here to make sure it's going to align properly on the back. making sure that's going to be right. I need to cut off another small piece to glue to the top to get my 15 inches in height. The way I hold pieces together before gluing them is with these sewing needles. You can get these at any craft store. They're $3, $4, $5, you know, for a pack of maybe 500 or 1,000. They're great for holding things in place temporarily. I just wanted to put my 1/6 scale Hot Toys Boba Fett in here just to make sure my proportions on my measurements were like I was thinking before I proceeded. It's good to stop and check your work like this too, just to make sure that you don't get super far into the piece and realize you did something wrong. So again, I'm using the width on that piece to trim off the additional, I think it was 3 inches or 4 inches of foam I needed to top off the back side. This is a hot wire foam cutting table. Now I marked it with my blade where I needed that, I believe, a 4-inch cut. I'm moving the fence and locking it into place, right? So these are actually fairly cheap. If you can find this particular brand, it's Hot Wire Foam Factory on their website, or even on eBay you can find these. I think they have them on Amazon too. They're affordable and they are extremely easy to use. Now I'm using a ruler to make sure that fence is set perpendicular to the bottom, because this particular foam cutter doesn't come with grid lines so that I can line things up. So I have to do this sometimes to make sure it's nice and parallel to the front and to the wire. But once you have it plugged in, that wire gets hot and you can just glide your foam right through and make a perfectly beautiful cut, and you don't have to sand down any seams. The reason I didn't do the first 3 cuts like this is because the depth my cutter will allow me to go to is only about 10 inches. So sometimes when you're over 10 inches, you just have to do it with a knife. And that's Mr. Foamy Pac-Man. There's my piece on top. And now I'm gonna go ahead and abut those seams of the smaller piece and glue them together, just making sure they were the right size. You can use white glue to glue this foam. You can use tacky glue, but this is the glue that I prefer right here. This is Styro Goo. That is the brand name of this glue. It is a clear foam glue that you can get at hwff.com. I think this company and this brand is great. This stuff gets really hard and tacky within 15-20 minutes. It's still actually movable too once it's tacky, which is nice and helpful in case you bump something out of place. But for joining 2 seams like this, you're going to want to apply a liberal amount of glue. I just spread it evenly with my finger. It's non-toxic, so it's not going to hurt you like that. Abut those seams, make sure they are lined up, and then you're going to want to grab some more of those sewing needle pins. And so on those edges, on the outside edges, I'm just putting 2 sewing needle pins in opposing angles, going through one piece into the other piece of foam to hold it roughly in place while that glue sets up. And again, this glue sets up quick, but not like epoxy, 5-minute epoxy quick. Just enough to keep everything in place so you can keep working. And if you have to make an adjustment, you can. That's why I prefer this glue. It's stronger than white glue and PVA glue, but it's also movable. Here I am gluing the back to the bottom, and I'm going to use the glue bottle in a different way. You may have never seen this before, but I use it like a glue stick. I'll take the tip off and I will spread it just like that, because this particular glue, this foam glue, is very, very thick and viscous, and it allows you to do that without it just pouring out of the bottle. Another reason I like this glue. I highly recommend it. hwff.com. This is not a sponsorship. I just really, really love this glue for using it with foam. It's perfect. Here I'm using a large speed square to make sure that my rear of my diorama is perfectly perpendicular to the base. You don't have to do this. You can just go get like a box or something that you have where you know the angle is a perfect 90-degree angle, and put it up to here just so that you have something to hold everything in place so that you know it's all aligned. I just have a couple of these around from doing my secular work. I'm using those sewing needle pins again, strategically placed so that they keep even pressure on the back wall to the base, just to make sure that, again, that they stay where I want them to stay as that glue starts to set up. When the glue is set up after about 30-40 minutes of working, I'll just pull the pins out. It's usually safe enough to do that, and you won't move it out of place. Again, another reason I really love this glue. You can get that glue at craft stores. It's just a clear foam glue. This particular brand, though, I give them props because they sent me some cool stuff in the past when they saw the type of work I did. So I appreciate this company, and I appreciate that brand of glue. And just continuing to place those pieces and then checking my fit to make sure that nothing gets shifted out of place. That's really important. And here I'm making another mark. I'm going to cut a piece to add some interest, just sort of an overhang. This is about a 5-inch piece I'm cutting off. And I'm cutting some strips that are maybe 3/8 of an inch thick off of this scrap piece of foam that I ended up with, so I can add maybe an additional detail or like a curb piece. Out of that top piece, I cut this chunk out. That's just to create some sort of positive and negative space in the detail. And then I'm knocking that cut down to make sure it's a nice smooth side. And I decided to round over or bevel or fillet these edges, as you might say, depending on what country you're from, with some 80 grit sandpaper. Just to add some more interest and detail without really having to do much. Just rounding over some edges like this can really pop up the feel of the diorama or the foam piece that you're building. So you can see after I've knocked those two pieces down and you put them up next to each other, they create a whole different look than just perfectly straight edges that I had before. And separated, they're going to look even better. That's the piece that I cut out, and that's what it looks like without it. So I'm going to glue that down here, and I'm going to kind of use them as a trick to maybe help hide the seam I created with my adjoining piece. Again, using that glue that I had, that hot wire foam factory glue, as a glue stick, just to spread an even amount of glue across my foam pieces. Again, this glue is so thick, you can basically do this. You do have to do it quickly, but it's not going to just run out of the bottle as long as you kind of keep the bottle at the right angle. You can squeeze the bottle and just spread it out just like it was a glue stick, like you're working with craft paper in elementary school. And it'll hold really, really nice, and it'll hold things together very, very strong, especially if you do like a cross back and forth like I did with that glue there. This piece, I'm putting it in there just to make sure they push apart the correct amount of space so that everything lines up dimensionally. That 14-inch width that I was going for is maintained. And I'm using a smaller speed square just to make sure that it is perpendicular to the sidewalls and I didn't tilt anything at a weird angle. Again, you don't have to do this. These are just little things I do to make sure that when it's done and you're looking at it straight on, everything will look level. And going back to some more of those sewing needle pins to hold it in place. This is why it's good to get a whole bunch of those, because you may end up doing a whole diorama like this. This also allows you to work a lot faster. You don't have to constantly wait for things to glue. You can just keep working. You see all those pins in there? It's starting to look like something, right? We've got that interesting overhang. Now I'm going to cut one of those trapezoidal pieces you see in some of the Tatooine and Navarro designs from the Star Wars universe. You get these trapezoid pieces sort of holding up the exterior walls on different designs on Tatooine. At least that's how I like to imagine it. And I'm using a 3-inch thick piece of packing styrofoam. I got this out of the dumpster. I am a little bit of a dumpster diver for cheap materials, when they're clean. If this was covered in food, I wouldn't be getting it out of there. But I'm just measuring out the shape I want and cutting it out on my hot wire cutter. And you can do this with a very, very sharp knife. You just want to go slow because this foam tends to tear extremely easy. But if you invest in one of these hot wire cutters, you can get them for anywhere from $30 to $60, this type of cheap one, and do all kinds of cool stuff with it. Now I'm going to cut a negative chunk out of it so that it will slide into that piece properly on the above side. And I'm just drawing my reference point for that. This one, I'm kind of just winging it. I'm not trying to be absolutely perfectly flawless with these cuts, because you will see when we go to add the texture that it will allow us to kind of sort of hide some of our sins or mistakes we may make with some of our seams. So there's my mark, and when I go to cut this out, you'll see that it's a little off, but again, it won't really matter. So I'm just freehanding it there. I'm not lining it up perfectly, just kind of checking it, cutting it, checking it, cutting it. And you see there, it lines up pretty well. It fits in the space. There's a little bit of space on some of the parts in the back there, like right there. But again, that'll all be hidden when we get into the texture part. Again, using the glue bottle like a glue stick, spreading quite a liberal amount on this too to make sure it does not budge. And I made sure that angle, that back angle, was a right angle so that it would help hold the piece perfectly parallel and perpendicular. Again, using a speed square just to make sure everything lines up nicely so that at the end, when you look at it with your eye, it won't look off. These things are important. If you get to the end of your piece and things are all twisted and tilty, you'll be upset that you didn't catch it earlier. Again, doing another visual test. just to make sure those 6 scale figures look nice in here. This is meant to be a 6 scale display, although you could use it for larger or smaller pieces. And I'm just taking some scrap pieces of PVC pipe that I had lying around, just seeing maybe where they would fit or where they would look nice in the diorama. You can find these at Home Depot in the plumbing aisle if you don't already know. You know, they're cheap. You can get stuff for under $1, you know, usually no more than $2 or $3. I would just encourage you to go look. Go look at what you might want to use in your diorama and pick something out that fits. And I'm just tracing out the placement of where I'm going to want to put this piece. I decided to just put this one piece on this side. I didn't want to overdo it. And I'm using the piece to put a depression into the foam so that I know where to maybe cut a little guide, because it will allow me to sink the PVC pipe into the foam a little and glue it, which will make it a little bit stronger. Now on to the texture. Using spackling paste or drywall putty. This stuff is cheap. I recommend getting a tub about this size if you're going to planning on doing a couple of dioramas over the course of your time, and a cup of water. Having a cup of water nearby, and guess what? You're going to get some dirty hands. So just wet your fingers and glob it into the seams. I usually start with the seams like this and fill them in. Incidentally, I learned how to do this from caulking the seams around doors and windows. You know, using my finger to spread material. It's honestly one of the best tools you have. So here I am just going around the diorama, filling in all the seams with that drywall putty and spackling paste. It really doesn't matter what brand. You just, some of them are drier and some of them are wetter. I can't tell you which ones are which. You're just going to have to experiment. You'll notice that as you're spreading it, it may dry quicker, but you're just going to have to get used to which one you buy. They're all going to behave a little bit differently, and your environment may react a little bit differently too, like if you're in a humid area or a dry area. And here I am adding the texture to the back wall of the diorama. This is a spreader that I got from the paint aisle at the hardware store. I actually cut it in half so it was a little bit smaller, and I am intentionally unevenly spreading it. This is sort of indicative of the techniques that stucco guys and drywall texture guys will use when they're building your house. They will intentionally spread things a certain way and then drag the spreader across it and knock it back down to get specific textures. And if you pay attention to the Star Wars theme that we're going for here, the Desert Planet diorama, it's usually pretty uneven. And of course, they're going for sort of that simplistic, sort of native peoples on Tatooine, just working with the materials they have vibe. So I am just trying to kind of imitate that with how I spread this, just kind of spreading and knocking it down and spreading and knocking it down until I get something that I'm happy with, right? So you're just gonna have to go around the diorama and do that. And I'm not really pressing very hard. I will press it down in a few places, and I'm kind of pointing out here where you want some exposed, a little bit, not so much super exposed, but less and more in certain areas. So you get this variation in texture. And see how I tapped it down 3 times, a couple times there, and then I dragged the scraper over it. That creates that uneven texture and that sort of layered effect, and that's what we're going for. It looks like maybe many layers built up over time where they've had to fix and repair the walls, or where they laid it on thick and then had to spread it back out. And I'm just going over all of the surface areas that I want to have this texture on the entire diorama. And it just takes some time and some practice. You'll see later that some of these edges on this big white foam piece, I didn't get covered as well as I want to. So it is important while you're doing this step to try to get it as evenly covered as possible when it comes to the amount, so that the pink foam has some texture over it. Now, you might have to do this with whatever piece of PVC pipe you use in your diorama, but there is words and writing as far as the different types of schedule of PVC that it is. I'm just using that 80 grit sandpaper to knock it down off the piece. This 80 grit sandpaper leaves pretty deep marks like you see there in this PVC. So I will knock it down and get that texture off of there initially with 80 grit, but then I will go back with a 120 grit and sand that grit down even more so that it smooths out a little bit, so that when we paint it, that sanding where you sanded it off is a lot less apparent or kind of disappears under the layers of paint. I'm just wiping it off with a wet rag because sometimes this PVC stuff doesn't come off without a wet rag. And now I am going to use some of this flat black and do a base coat. It's always a good idea to base coat pretty much anything that you do. And you can just use spray paint on this PVC pipe. It works great. And then I'm going back with this Rust-Oleum hammered. This paint gives a super, super nice texture, especially if you're going for an older or a weathered look. The hammered texture that it leaves once you spray it on is kind of perfect for sort of an off-worldly or older look to it. You can see that there before it's dry, it's got sort of that bumpy look. That's what I was going for. Now here, I let this dry overnight on this back wall, and you see how many sort of sharp ridges and little things poking up? Sometimes as this dries, it kind of wants to curl up a little bit like that. And so then you're going to take 120 grit sandpaper, and these are just some torn off pieces that I'm going to hold in my hand. Just kind of maybe fold them around a couple of fingers or bend them in place and just go around and sand it all down. You don't want to sand too far, otherwise you're going to ruin your texture. You know, you're going to have to experiment with that, how much you take on or off when it comes to applying it and sanding it back down. But I'm just going through and sanding all those sort of sharp edges that occurred as it dried and evening it all back out, just so it's got, again, that smooth, weathered look to it. I decided that I did want to do this texture on the base. I am going to put sand down on this later, but I felt like I should do this a little bit so that once I lay the sand down, it's not perfectly flat sand. It has some undulation to it, some up and down, like you would get, you know, on a real desert planet, you know. Obviously, if it was perfectly flat, it would kind of look suspect. Now I'm going to start painting this diorama. I was working on 3 little pieces at the same time when I did this. This is another one that I had already gone through the process with. But I'm pointing here into the corners because I'm using a dark espresso color to create some initial shading. If you skip this step, it will be fine. But you see here how I've done it. This actually can help appreciate the value and look of your piece in different lightings. When you paint shading under your finished coat, it will come through. If you don't do it, your eye will be able to tell the difference. So I'm just hitting it lightly, and I know it doesn't look like because it's a dark color, but I'm hitting it lightly in the areas that would get natural shadows. And this is the cool thing about covering this foam with spackling paste or drywall putty, is you can spray paint it once it's covered. You just have to have at least a thin spreading of it over all the foam. And you see, even in those pink areas, there is a little bit of texture there. You just don't want to hit it too hard. With your first 1 or 2 layers, you want them to be sort of thin and sparse as you spray this on. Otherwise, it will find its way through the foam. And here I'm just showing you a close-up of what that texture looks like before it's knocked down with sanding paper. I thought this was a good opportunity to show that. And then you come in with some sandpaper, and you start to see how that sort of rubbed down effect gets with that paint on there. It shows through with that light spritzing of paint, how the sanding, what it does to the texture. You see there how it knocks down and smooths it all out. That's what you were doing in the previous step. So this seemed like a good place to show that and demonstrate the sort of depth you get and the interest it creates for your piece. This is a smart thing to do, and it takes a little bit of practice, but you'll be happy you did it when you're done. Don't skip the sanding. Don't skip the sanding. So this is an example of the price you might pay if you don't evenly coat your foam with spackling paste. I had to redo some of the edges on this white foam. It was hard to see because the foam is white, the spackling paste is white, but it melted through. So I had to go over that because these spray paints have solvents which will melt the foam. That's why doing that even coat is so important. And then you can do this. Then you can come back with your main colors and spray over it. I would encourage you to go and just experiment with colors. I'm showing you the ones that I'm using in this video as I grab them and use them. But this is my mid-tone color that I'm deciding to use. I would say go and pick a dark, a mid-tone, and a light that you like, wherever you might get your can of spray paint. But you can see in those edges and angles where I painted that darker tone coming through in this mid-tone. That's why it's important. It adds interest to your piece. At this point, I had gone over that piece with different color washes that I created just using black, white, and I believe the color is called nutmeg, which is a mid-tone brown. And I made lighter, darker washes. And what a wash is just a color of paint mixed with a lot of water. And you can either brush it on or sponge it on or literally just pour it on and then wipe it off. That's what some of the dried wash looks like. These are the colors that I use. These are just ones off the shelf at Walmart. You don't need expensive paints, especially for this step. And I just did it back and forth and wiped it on and dabbed it on until I got to this point. I do end up changing this later because I realized it wasn't necessarily the color that I wanted. I added that piece here. I felt like it needed one more little piece. That is a piece of a sprinkler system. And for the next step, which is one of the most important steps, we're going to cover the base with Mod Podge and play sand. This is just play sand you can buy off the shelf at the hardware store. It's got the right color to use as a base. And I'm taping off the base just so that that Mod Podge doesn't leak over the edge. We don't want that. We want a nice clean finish. And this is where I use a cheap brush, or a chip brush as they're called. They're usually like 59 cents. And I am spreading a very thick layer of Mod Podge and then tapping the sand around and doing a thick layer of sand as well. That's important to use a thick layer of Mod Podge for this style of diorama, because if you spread it very, very thinly, it might, number one, dry before you even pour the sand on. And number two, your layer of sand might be so thin that it might just not look right. And you want it to be dense, because this is supposed to be on a planet that's basically made of sand, right? Anakin's famous line, "I hate sand, it gets everywhere." Well, in this diorama, we want it to get everywhere. So this is what it looks like before the Mod Podge is dry. And this is what made me change the color of the wall. I realized it wasn't the sand color I was going for. So I got a khaki brown and I lightened it up. So these are the other two pieces I was working on. I used the same techniques to do those and the same materials. And I had to tape off the PVC pipe to get it. So here you see the colors I used. That's sort of a burlap and the khaki gloss. I did use a gloss, but I knocked it down with my matte finish later. That stupid gloss, I hate it so much. And you get a nice finish. And so I painted the sand in this case, but you can see here the sand looked too bright now. So I went back, and here is an example of what the sand looks like unpainted and painted. And I ultimately changed it again. Here we have our final product, ladies and gentlemen. So this is that image you saw in the last video, but with some black washes. And you see getting the watered down black paint and letting it sort of run down the diorama and then dabbing it off with a paper towel allowed it to sort of seep into these cracks, and then doing some wiping down with it allowed it to get some of these streak lines that you see. Especially in here, I felt like water or grease or oil or smog might collect into a crevice like this and then leak down. So you get some streak lines here. I did the same thing on the pipe, just to give it some streaks. It's kind of hard to see with the sheen on the pipe. And then I just dabbed some into the corners and let it spread out on its own and dry, so it looked like it had some sort of leaks from maybe some oil or grease over time. Now, there is no exact science to doing what I just explained. You're just gonna have to go for it. You really just have to experiment. So create some washes with a little bit of paint and a lot of water. Get some brushes, dab it on there, and see what it does. You know, if you don't like it, wipe it off. It's not a big deal. Just get it before it dries. And, you know, it takes a while to dry, so you don't really have anything to worry about. But this is what you get. I went around with that nutmeg brown at the end, and I just evenly colored the edges of my diorama with nutmeg brown. I can hardly say that. Just to give it a nice finished look. Now, I would call this diorama sort of beginner leaning into intermediate, because there is some sort of advanced techniques involved, but not super crazy. You can see how this diorama really works well. It sort of doubles as a Navarro or Tatooine diorama, or any sort of desert planet, if you will. It could be Jakku if you want it to. But you can see how you could really experiment with these ideas, adding all kinds of different piping and embellishments. Again, it doesn't have to be pipe either. You could do flat pieces, or if you have scrap piece of plastic laying around, you want to paint it and glue it on, go nuts. And this is my 1/18th scale diorama, using all the same techniques as well as a few more. If you go watch my Batcave video series where I talk about how I made a giant miniature Batcave, there's a couple techniques from that video series that I used here, such as using this pipe and creating these pipes and making this door using some of the materials that I did not discuss in this video. I also made this little accessory out of found objects just so it could be placed and used by the person that is going to. As I made this diorama, I cut off pieces that could abut easily together at certain linear angles so that they could be separated or rearranged to make a new diorama. You see here, you can switch the pieces around and still have and aligned diorama. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate it. Please let me know in the comments what you would do differently, what I didn't explain well enough, and please join me over on Patreon. Please join me over on Patreon for more detailed content as soon as that goes live, which should be by March 1st. I am the Ron Swanson of dioramas.